Hello, I'm Alan Fleury with the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences. What's the most important element that determines a child's future success? Is it IQ, good grades, good behavior, or is it something much more fundamental? My guest today on Unscripted is journalist Paul Tough, author of How Children Succeed: Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. A former editor and reporter at the New York Times, Tough won widespread recognition for his 2008 book, Whatever It Takes: Geoffrey Canada's Quest to Change Harlem and America. The Whatever It Takes initiative in Athens seeks to support our families and schools in producing well-educated children. I spoke with Tough prior to his lecture in the UGA chapel. Your first book, Whatever It Takes, was very successful, yet How Children Succeed doesn't seem like a direct follow-up to it. It seems like you are taking some of the parts to it and putting them into more manageable bites with research. Is that an accurate description?
I mean, to me, it feels more connected, but that might just be because I'm the author, so I've lived the same life, so I can sort of see the connections. Yeah, like in lots of ways, I feel like the new book was trying to answer questions that I hadn't been able to answer in Whatever It Takes. And from a reporting point of view, I felt like there was something great about just writing about one organization and one guy. It puts a nice frame around things. You sort of know what's part of your book and what's not, which is reassuring in lots of ways, and it gives it a natural narrative. But I think part of what I wanted to do with this book was look at lots of different organizations and characters and ideas and see how they all fit together. So that's a different kind of book, right? Because you're right, there's not one, you're sort of flitting from place to place. But for me, the challenge and what I was trying to do was make all those things fit together and show how these ideas were playing out on the chessboard and in this high school in Chicago and in this rat lab in Montreal.
Mm-hmm. The book takes part of its focus as a Fenger High School in Chicago and the seemingly intractable situation there. And it kind of reminded me of when I was an undergraduate political science major and we read Savage Inequalities by Kozel. If you can, maybe briefly, tell me, how have things in Chicago changed as far as the school system? Is it drastically different or very similar?
Different from the Kozel years?
The era.
Yeah, I would say it has not changed that much. I think in terms of the lives, I mean, the way most kids are experiencing it. It's been through lots of different iterations of reform. And I think there are lots of good things that have happened. And I think that my sense is that the inequalities are not mostly about how much money gets spent on schools and what kind of resources the schools have, which I think was more true in the past. But I think there's still a big difference in terms of the quality of the education and in terms of the experience that kids have. It's also true, I'm not sure if this was true in Kozel's day, but it's also true that mostly the Chicago school system now is just educating low-income minority kids. 7 in 8 kids are in the school system are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, which is usually the cutoff we think of for low-income kids. I think a similar portion in the 80%, somewhere in the 80s, is Black or Hispanic. So it's not so much like a segregated system as just that, like the white kids, the middle class and upper middle class white kids don't go to the public schools for the most part.
Right.
Either they've moved to the suburbs or they're going to private schools or other types of schools. So I think that may be different from the Kozel days as well. But I have to say, I'd done a bunch of reporting in low-income neighborhoods in New York, especially in Harlem, but in other places. And reporting on the south side of Chicago was still kind of a shock to my system. There's something about the south side, I think, that is, it's like geographically, it's just so huge. Mm-hmm. And so I think the poverty is different than it was a couple of decades ago, mostly because the huge housing projects are gone.
Right.
And so that sort of intensely concentrated poverty and dysfunction is not there in quite the same way. But I think there are whole neighborhoods that are still really intensely dysfunctional and poor. And there's just something about the way you feel isolated down there. You're cut off from the subway. You're, like 20 miles from the north part of the city. And so it just feels bleak in a way that New York never, even Harlem and the South Bronx never quite felt to me.
Your reporting brings up an interesting point because you follow the progress of several groups of people. How do you keep from getting too emotionally involved in what's going on?
It's a good question. So I feel like, I think I have some kind of like reporter's instinct, for better or worse, that like lets me look at the particular situation that I'm in a more detached way than I think a lot of people would do. And I think, I just think I believe that sort of journalistic idea that the most effective thing that you can do to help kids in a situation like that is to like write a really good story about them, and just be as accurate and as possible. And like in order to do that, I think I've got to separate myself from the moment a little bit. And so I think that's part of it. But I feel like there were a lot of really emotional parts of the reporting. And partly I think, reporting, I feel like there were particular moments that were upsetting in various ways, but I think it was also just like the accumulation of it that I would spend. There were a couple of months where I would just be down on the South Side every day, and when I would be driving home, I would just realize I felt like kind of worn out and depressed, and then I would realize, but I'm going home, like to a pretty nice neighborhood where I get to like eat nice food and hang out with my family. And like that there was something about that hit home more, that like all these kids were staying, and that thinking about the way that wears kids down, I think was really eye-opening for me.
And then you have to take pains to remove most of that from your narrative, and yet keep the very special parts that keep everyone engaged.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I tried to do, like lots of journalists do, is find particular characters whose stories I felt like exemplified and would help people really understand what was going on. And there were, one of the things about writing about kids, young people in general, is that their lives are often very dramatic. They're often very good at talking about their lives, and I found some characters who were really good at doing that. And I think particularly some of the young people who were involved in some of the programs that I was writing about, they were at this moment of change in their lives, often really good change. There were at least a few of them who were in the midst of doing this really hard work of trying to transform themselves with the help of various mentors and teachers and doctors and others. And so that's a really dramatic and involving story to be able to tell.
How Children Succeed is a book of stories about people, but at its heart it is a book about an idea. And the idea at the center of the book is that the conventional wisdom that has guided our thinking about education and child development for the last couple of decades has been misguided. We've been emphasizing the wrong qualities in children, and we have been using the wrong strategies to develop those qualities. The name that I give to this conventional wisdom in the book is the cognitive hypothesis. It's this idea that I think a lot of us share, even if we don't often speak it out loud, that the one quality that matters most in a child's success is his or her IQ, this narrow band of cognitive skills that we measure with standardized tests. I think this idea is behind our national obsession with test scores, from preschool admission tests to statewide standardized tests to SATs and ACTs. Even when, as individuals, we tell ourselves that they don't matter much, as a nation, we've invested them with a huge amount of importance. And I think that's because we all believe, on some level, that they really measure what matters. But the scientists and educators who I'm writing about in this book are arguing for a very different set of characteristics that they say are at least as important as IQ and possibly more important. They include curiosity, grit, conscientiousness, self-control, optimism. Economists call these non-cognitive skills. Psychologists call them personality traits. Neuroscientists often refer to them as executive functions. And educators, and I think a lot of the rest of us, often think of them as character.
And one of the young women you write about, Kawana Lerma, she describes being talked to by her mother and her great-grandmother. And they tell her in a very moving sequence that they don't want her to end up like them or her mother. And it got me thinking about, and it's a subtext throughout your book, of the particular gravity that people have to fight to escape to go beyond the bounds of being around people who haven't gone to college, who haven't done these other things in life to which they strive.
Right. I mean, I definitely felt that in Kiwana's case. I mean, she is sort of a remarkable person because she has such a clear vision of the goal that she wants, and it's, you know, about college success and professional success. But, you know, she hasn't really been exposed to it at all. It's really just like notional for her, which I think is really rare for young people, for anybody to be able to do that, to be able to really aspire to something that you haven't actually seen up close. You know, that's why, you know, I think some mentor programs and programs that expose kids to different sort of lives and different kind of professions are useful, because then they actually have something to hang on to and to focus on. And she hadn't even had that. But so yeah, I think that gravity though is very real. And one of the things that I found profound about the research that I was able to draw on was finding that gravity is not just cultural, but also neurochemical, you know? That there's a lot about what is going on in the environment that these kids are living in that is literally just changing their brain chemistry in a way that makes it really difficult for them to escape. And there's something about that is both more daunting, you know, because we think of brain chemistry as something that's pretty permanent, but also, to me, a little bit more hopeful, because I think there's something about culture that just feels so, like, squishy and like there's not much you can do about it, you know? It's just like, that's just culture, we can't change that. Whereas neurochemistry, like, it's hard to change, but we know something about how that works, and we know something about how to stop that cycle and how to change that cycle. And so I think there is something about that part of the research that is, to me, more hopeful than not.
Is that part of the implicit message of all of the research that you include in that book, is the effects of things like stress on the chemistry in our brain? We can do something about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's just really useful to know this information, you know? I think it lets you think about interventions and solutions in a different way. And it's, you know, it's like, it's not research that we're dealing with in a public policy way. There's not really, you know, when you go to like school reform conferences, people aren't really talking about neurochemistry. But I think it's a really useful, I think these facts are really important, and I think in lots of ways it's a useful way to understand what's going on in kids' lives.
And one of the most profound discoveries that this new generation of neuroscientists has made is the connection between child brain chemistry and adult psychology. That under this noble and complex set of characteristics that we think of as character, you can actually see the mundane and mechanical interaction of chemicals in the brains of infants. The research that these scientists are doing suggests that there are two times in a child's life that are particularly, where they're particularly susceptible to interventions to try to improve these non-cognitive skills. One is in early childhood, when their brains are particularly malleable. But the other is in adolescence. And it's in adolescence that kids for the first time become what psychologists call metacognitive, meaning that they can think about their own thinking. They can reflect on their own thought processes. They can think about themselves. And as you know, if you've hung out with teenagers, they really, really like thinking about themselves. And this is actually something that, if you want to intervene and help them in some way, you can really take advantage of.
And it's tricky, for sure, because I think that we don't, you know, none of us who aren't scientists have a really clear, you know, science confuses us in lots of ways. And once we start talking about brain chemistry, I think it can send people down some wrong paths. But I would say, like, let's talk about it more rather than less, and not let the science sort of scare us off.
Right, and it's also an interesting thing to keep us talking about poverty in the sense of what that does to us and all the stress that creates on people who are living with these struggles day to day.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think we've known for a long time that poverty is, it's hard, right? It's hard to grow up in poverty. It's hard for kids to get out of poverty. But I don't think we've known why to the extent that we do now, and that we're starting to more through the research that I'm trying to write about. And so I think that we've tended to grab onto explanations that aren't necessarily backed up by the facts. I mean, everything from genetics to culture to, you know, nutrition, like that's important, but like that's not really the most important thing. There are other things in the environment of poor kids that are making a much bigger difference than I think some of the culprits that we tend to focus on. And the more that we can identify those, I think the more that we can actually try to solve them.
I think you're right. I think the more that we can call things what they are, familiarize ourselves with their effects on people, the more hopefully we'll be willing to put some energy toward them, finding solutions.
It also takes you out, I think, of I hope anyway, that it takes you out of the sort of traditional political divide on what's going on in the lives of poor kids. You know, I think we tend to go to either very rigid left or right explanations for what's going on with poor kids, partly because I think it is such an upsetting topic when you really pay attention to it, that it makes it easier. So. Yeah, but I think, you know, for that reason, it's easier to look for villains, that it's just, you know, it's just like lazy parents, or it's just, you know, the capitalist system that's keeping people down. I think that makes it easier for us, because there's somebody to blame. But when we actually look at what's going on, and that it is this combination of circumstances plus decisions, neurochemistry plus culture, and you know, partly has to do with the structure of the economy around these families, partly has to do with the families themselves. And it gets more complicated, it gets harder to talk about, and it gets like fuzzy in ways that I think can be scary for us sometimes.
Right.
But I think it also then helps us get to solutions, and also it pushes us out of our comfort zone, I think, both on the left and the right, and pushes us toward a place where we can actually look for new solutions.
You spend a good deal of time in the book talking about playing chess and how important that is and its effect on our thinking. At one point, you quote a source saying that in choosing to play chess, we're celebrating freedom above utility, which is beautiful. Couldn't we say the same thing about making art and its importance in teaching us how to think?
Yeah, I think we could. And I would put music in there as well.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, one thing that I really took from that chess chapter was that a lot of what was making the difference for these kids, well, I'll go one step back. So I think, you know, a lot of what this chess teacher was teaching these kids was not intellectual skill, which I had always thought was the one thing that mattered in chess, but were you know, non-cognitive skills, character strengths. And she was teaching them how to get motivated, how to sit at the chessboard for 4 hours at a time, how to learn from your mistakes.
Yeah, not give up.
Right.
Right.
And all that makes a huge difference when you're playing scholastic chess. And I think that a lot of that was because of the particular sort of training relationship that you have when you're a chess teacher. She was able to go through each game with these kids and show them what they'd done wrong, and she was kind of, you know, could be a little tough on them in showing them what they did wrong. But I think they really learned from that. And I think that when, you know, I talked to lots of adults who say the same thing when they look back at like which teachers had a big effect on them. It's often not, you know, an English or math teacher, it's often a music teacher, an art teacher, a coach, a chess teacher. And I think it's somebody who's in that relationship with you where they're like forcing you to pay attention to what you did wrong, whether it's on the football field or, you know, that high E that you just missed on your violin. That you get this sort of, you know, instant feedback from them that helps you get better, and that learning that process of like, here's what I did wrong, here's what I have to do better, is very valuable, not only in terms of the skill, but in terms of our character. And I think it's harder to do that in more academic fields. Not impossible, but harder.
But it reminded me of an anecdote I heard in a commencement address at the art school a couple of years ago. And the speaker, a gallerist from Atlanta, described how if you ask kids in kindergarten who wants to be an artist, everyone raises their hands. And if you ask them in 3rd grade, 3 or 4 or 5 hands go up. And if you ask them in 7th grade, there might be 1 hand that goes up. And her point was that we systematically eliminate that out of people's hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
It's pretty stark.
It is pretty stark. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of, I mean, one of the words in the subtitle of my book is curiosity, you know, which I think is very connected to creativity. And I think there's lots about the way that schools work right now, and arguably the way that childhood works, that argues, you know, that pushes kids away from both curiosity and creativity. Like I think about my 3-year-old son, and he is like, he's definitely would put his hands up if you asked him if he wanted to be an artist.
Yeah.
He's a great artist. But But I think, in some way he's got nowhere to go but down, not in terms of his skill, but just in terms of his curiosity and his creativity. Like
Yeah.
right now, he just wants to explore the world, just wants to ask questions, wants to try new things. And yeah, it scares me the extent to which I think the school system can work against those things and kind of push him toward choosing less exciting options, finding less exciting answers to various questions.
There's one thing that it made me think about as far as you brought up what's wrong with schools and how it might be just our educational system in general might be on the wrong track. How would we possibly go about turning an aircraft carrier like traditional American high schools into anything else?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of hunger for change. Certainly in terms of people I talked to both as a reporter and now, out talking about this book, I feel like parents, teachers, they're really eager for some different directions. So that's reassuring or hopeful to me. But I also feel like the other thing that's I think going to really push it is just economic need. Like, it really is true. We do need a different kind of worker in the 21st century, and this is like something you always hear in presidential debates, but we really have fallen from having the most college graduates or graduating the highest percentage of our young adults being college graduates in the mid-90s to being, I think, 16th now, like in 15 years. It's like this incredibly fast fall.
Yeah.
And that really matters, this is a big deal in terms of I don't think we're really feeling the impact yet. But in terms of like our global competitiveness 50 years from now, we really need to figure it out. And so the one thing that I find kind of reassuring is that the American economy usually does respond pretty well to economic incentives, even if it doesn't, not necessarily into like making kids more creative or curious.
Right.
But I think those two, I think those things are actually starting to connect. That like in the past, I think the American high school was really set up to create workers for
That's the
the
change we're talking
50s,
about.
right? It was like, it's really good if you're creating people to like work in an office at IBM. It's
Right.
good if you're creating people to work on an assembly line. But we don't have any of those jobs anymore in either blue collar or white collar. And now we have very different jobs where you have to have more initiative, you have to be more flexible, you have to just be more flexible because you're probably going to work a lot more different types of jobs. So you have to have this different set of skills. And I think non-cognitive skills are a really big part of what's going to make kids successful no matter where they are on the income spectrum or the education spectrum.
It's not limited to, this subject's not limited to just certain segments of society. These grit, character, perseverance, themes of your book, these seem to be things that elude people both at the bottom of the economic pyramid and at the top.
For sure.
And so that's one of the things that can get people's attention, even though it happens for different reasons, right?
Right, absolutely.
You see people, well, actually, you talk about that a lot near the end, that people who can afford to give their kids a lot of everything realize that that's one of the things they can't.
Right. Right, I know, and in some ways it's actually what a lot, I think, of affluent parents are doing for their kids, are denying them the opportunities to develop character strengths like
Right.
grit and self-control. That was one of the more surprising things that I found doing this book. I thought I was mostly writing a book about poor kids and initiatives to help them, but I found there was this big conversation going on among affluent parents and teachers and kids. I think it's in some ways still starting as a national conversation, but it's very intense when you go to private schools or affluent suburban high schools. There's I think a lot of anxiety that the way that those folks have been educating and preparing and helping their kids has been counterproductive and is really backfiring, I think, for a lot of kids. And that I think a lot of parents feel like they've created this system that is producing a lot of really good test takers, but not kids who have the inner strength to deal with challenges, to get over setbacks, to sort of make their own way in life. So one of the things I find hopeful about that is that it is a very, I feel like well-off parents are a very powerful self-correcting organism.
Certainly. Absolutely. Those are the people
information-
who are involved in schools, though.
Exactly. Information travels fast. They're if they get the word that something they're doing isn't working, they'll change it on a dime. That's how baby Einstein became both the incredible phenomenon that it was, and then collapsed, I think. And so I think I hope anyway that those ideas are starting to change in those precincts. But part of what I'm hoping this book will accomplish is to get people in those communities to see the connections between what's going on with their kids and the families in which their kids live and the schools in which that their kids attend, and what's going on in high poverty neighborhoods, that are often just a few miles away.
Right.
And that the situations are very different, the needs are very different, but the underlying principles are exactly the same. And if we want to help, it's not just a question of this being about helping some kids, that focusing on these skills, I think, can really help all kids. And that to me is I hope anyway, is a new way to think about kids in poverty. I hope it will diminish our sense of distance from them as another culture, another species, and like people who are very separate from us, and we can really see how the experiences that they are having are very closely related to the experiences that we're having and our kids are having. Correct. So like if 60% of all income groups were like graduating from college, I'd be fine with that. That would be great. But right now those numbers are so far off. In fact, the gap has increased. The chance that a well-off kid will graduate from college is much higher than it has been in the past. Whereas for the lowest income quartile, college graduation rates have either gone down or stayed more or less the same, depending on whose numbers you trust. And so that gap is increasing, and that gap is a huge problem, because I think what we know both from the research and I hope from the stories that I'm trying to tell in this book is that there is huge potential among the lowest quartile of Americans to graduate from college and turn their lives, have a much more successful life than they would be if they didn't have a BA. And so to me, if there's like one thing that we should be pushing for, it's to increase those numbers of low-income Americans graduating from four-year colleges. And what I think some of these interventions show is that that's not actually as elusive a goal as it seems. It would sure help to have better preschools and home visiting programs and early childhood education to better prepare those kids all the way through their lives. But you can actually give them a lot of these skills in preparation for college with relatively minor interventions in high school and college. And I think especially if colleges kind of got in on the act too, and did more to help kids, first-generation college goers, to give them the kind of support they need to make it through 4 years of college, I feel like we could improve those numbers relatively quickly.
Do you think it's still important for people to go to college and major in English and history and art?
I do. I can't necessarily make the economic case for it, but as a guy who hopes to be writing more books, I like the fact that there are people out there who still want to read books.
Well, it's an interesting one to make from an economic perspective,
but yeah,
because you are making that case in effect.
Yeah, and I do think it's true. I think even in college there are skills that you learn, there are ideas that you learn from just being broadly educated, from learning a lot of different things that matter, not only in terms of making you a good and well-rounded person, but in terms of just preparing you for what the economy has in store for you, which is probably going to be a lot of chaos.
Yeah, a lot of questions.
That things are you're going to have to be able to think on your feet. You can't just stay in one place. You need to be able to react to different situations. And so, I think you can certainly make the case that reading Shakespeare helps. Reading Shakespeare helps you work in a modern office. You understand how people interact, how jealousy works, how rivalry works. That is, those are useful things to know in any situation.
It's a fascinating take on a very important subject. Thanks so much for talking to us. Good luck with your book.
Thank you very much.
Great
I appreciate it.